In 2015, global governments signed up to take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts when they agreed on the Sustainable Development Goals. In December 2015, they met in Paris to reach a climate deal. Climate change does not affect the globe equally. The countries responsible for the greater emissions of greenhouse gases are not necessarily the ones suffering the most. The least developed countries are among the most vulnerable in terms of exposure to the effects of climate change. With limited technical and financial resources, they face the greatest obstacles to adapt and develop with the current temperature rise. Many livelihoods and lives are threatened by climate change as weather events are becoming increasingly unpredictable and with greater devastating effects. In Paris, all countries were asked to contribute their solutions. Many of the least developed countries have shown their willingness to act by submitting detailed climate plans. We asked the leading climate experts from LDCs about their hopes for a climate deal and about the pledges they had made.
From the Bangladesh point of view, we have said that we will not increase our greenhouse gas emissions more than the average of the developing countries. We are committed, as a matter of fact, to be a part of the global process to reduce greenhouse gas, although we emit only 0.3 tons per capita per annum.
As much as the INDC is focusing on mitigation, but Uganda has clearly brought it out that for us, the main priority is adaptation, focusing on different sectors like agriculture, like water, livestock, and others.
Now, number one, we would like to see a legally binding agreement that limits global warming to a minimum. And ideally, we should limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. That's because we cannot afford the adaptation measures that will be required with a 2-degree increase in global temperatures. The rich world can afford that. Number two, we would like to see all parties, all countries, make ambitious and legally binding commitments to reduce greenhouse gases. Number three, we would like to see a support mechanism built into that agreement to support the LDCs and vulnerable countries.
Many LDCs mostly contribute to global emissions from agriculture, forestry, and land use. But with the need for development, these countries will be looking for support in building low-carbon economies.
The way we save our planet should be what science advises us and what social equity, what equity is expected. Yes, we will have adaptation and mitigation strategies to make our country and our planet free of impact of climate change, but this should come with the support of the developed countries where they play their responsibility in a differentiated way.
Experts say the Paris summit must deliver on climate financing, specifically putting adaptation funding as a priority.
The climate funding has to be predictable, has to be cramped. Private sector will go where there is profit to be made, and therefore they can probably come for mitigation activities like solar and so on. But adaptation in remote areas, I don't think private sector will go there. So therefore, it has to be official, it has to be government funding.
The funding that is available now in the country is focusing on mitigation. There's no funding for adaptation. And yet there's a lot of needs for adaptation. We cannot do mitigation alone without addressing adaptation issues.
Countries also expect greater commitment to the global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees C through new technologies.
As far as transport is concerned, most of our greenhouse gases are emitted in this sector. And so we are committed to improving the sustainability of transport by using low carbon technologies.
Current adaptation and mitigation efforts will not fully support communities that are bearing the brunt of the ever more intense and frequent weather hazards. With this in mind, experts from LDCs have pushed for the inclusion of loss and damage in the agreement.
The loss and damage should be separately treated in the fund process outside adaptation and mitigation. Countries who are highly impacted to the level of huge damage, they need to have a separate mechanism which is different from the mitigation fund, from the adaptation fund.
On December 12, 2015, close to 200 countries agreed to a climate deal in Paris. It was the first universal agreement to cut greenhouse gas emissions and limit effects of climate change. So, what is in this historic deal for the least developed nations?
For the least developed countries going into Paris, there were two major issues that we wanted to make sure were reflected in the agreement. First was the long-term goal of 1.5 degrees, which we, along with the small island states and the Africa group, were pushing for. We pushed very hard, we talked with everybody, we tried to persuade them, and in the end, we did, and that was a major achievement. The second was to ensure that the least developed countries were highlighted in terms of funding, particularly for adaptation. There had been promises made in the past, but not a lot of delivery on those promises. We wanted them to be delivered and ensured, and particularly focused on the least developed countries as one of the most vulnerable groups. Again, we achieved that to a very large extent. And the last thing that we, along with a number of other vulnerable countries, pushed for was to recognize loss and damage from the impacts of climate change as a reality. And we see that now. It is now a separate article in the Paris Agreement after our persuasion of the other countries that they should be so. The big challenge going into Paris, an agreement coming out of Paris, is that all countries are now working together. The developed countries have accepted their higher degree of responsibility, both because they have been emitting emissions of greenhouse gases for longer, and also because they have grown rich by emitting greenhouse gases, and therefore have bigger responsibilities. They have agreed to provide $100 billion a year from 2020 onwards, and that's a floor, not a ceiling. They will get bigger than that in amounts in the future, and they will provide funding for both mitigation in the large developing countries as well as adaptation in the most vulnerable countries. And that is now a major outcome in a legally binding format in the Paris Agreement.
Well, it won't be the last deal we do, and it may be better seen as the beginning of a continuous process. It has to be a good enough deal, a 2-degree world. That's quite a big ask, but it certainly won't encapsulate everything, which makes it absolutely certain that that's what we'll do.
We did an action inside the main UN conference area today. The deal that's on the table will at best get us 2.7 degrees C, which means catastrophic levels of sea level rise.
1.5 to stay alive. One life.
Keeping it at 1.5 will keep us safe. It'll keep the sea level rise at bay and make sure that we continue to live the life that we have a right to live. This is a call for standing not just for our communities at the front lines, but for humanity in general.
Hello, everybody.
I will deliver the clear and simple message
on climate change around the globe.
We have established
one of the most ambitious international climate agreements in human history.
Today was a great day, a historic,
legendary
day.
Hundreds of thousands of people called for action.
We've legislated, we've acted.
In the fight against global climate change.
It's a beautiful day, great day.
My name is Salim ul Haq. I'm Director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development based in Bangladesh, and also Senior Fellow at the International Institute for Environment and Development based in London. And I'm going to talk about something called the long-term goal in terms of the temperature target, or the long-term temperature target. A few years ago in Copenhagen, one of the things that countries had agreed on when the heads of state met was that the temperature target for setting a dangerous threshold, or a definition of what a dangerous threshold temperature would be 2 degrees. And this is one of the things that President Obama and the President of China actually agreed on. But there was a dissenting voice in that group, and that was the voice of President Nasheed of the Maldives, who was then President of the Maldives, who was speaking on behalf of both the small island developing states as well as the least developed countries, who disagreed with the 2-degree temperature target, saying that it wasn't good enough to protect the most vulnerable countries on the planet. And he wanted, and these countries also wanted, a 1.5-degree temperature target. However, the agreement was for the 2 degrees, but with a caveat, which was that they would revisit this temperature target in 2015, and between 2013 and 2015, they would have a review of the long-term temperature target. And that review would take place through something called a structured expert dialogue, which would involve experts looking at the difference between what a 2-degree world would look like versus a 1.5-degree world. That expert dialogue has been completed, and just a few weeks ago, the report was presented and was considered at the UNFCCC meeting in Bonn in June this year. And I'll summarize. They have 10 major messages coming out, but I'll summarize the main message, which is as follows. While 2 degrees is safe for many countries and many ecosystems, it is not safe for all countries and all ecosystems. And in order to enhance the level of safety to include those most vulnerable countries, communities, ecosystems, species, we need to think about a 1.5-degree target, which allows those to be saved. Now, we realize a 1.5-degree target take a lot of inputs, but we believe it's both technically and financially achievable. What we are lacking is political will, and that's what we want to do. So in Bonn, in the UNFCCC meeting, the least developed countries had a press conference, which I facilitated, where they supported and reiterated the 1.5-degree target. The climate vulnerable countries, which is another group of leaders of different vulnerable countries, also did the same. The youth group did a demonstration. The Climate Action Network, NGOs, had press conferences and a special issue of their daily newspaper called ECO on this issue in support of the 1.5-degree temperature goal. This is still a very, very contentious issue because not only are countries not even able to meet 2 degrees, there is very strong pressure to try and give up on the 2-degree target as being simply too difficult. And there are many voices making this case, particularly in the scientific community, people thinking that it's too late. On the other hand, there are scientists as well as people working on technologies who feel that with the right kind of incentives and investments, it is possible to ramp up our speed of renewable energy deployment and divestment out of fossil fuels and stopping fossil fuels as quickly as possible, so that the 1.5-degree target can actually be achieved. We believe it can be achieved, and we hope that in Paris there will be an agreement to move the target from 2 degrees to 1.5 degrees. But we realize it's a very tall order. I will be continuing to report back on this in the run-up to Paris and at Paris. So if you're interested in the topic, please keep abreast of our video logs as they come out.